I'm Carol Speakerman, and this is Speakerman Speaks Retail, presented by MarketScale. Hi, this is Carol, and welcome to episode 23 of Speakerman Speaks Retail, where we navigate retail from now to next through my latest retail trajectories and interviews with industry experts who are charting the course. In previous episodes, we've talked about how retailers are swinging attention back to their stores, and also how diversification into new formats and new business models, particularly solutions and services, are going to be the growth engine of the future for retail. Now, my guest today sits right in the sweet spot where all of these hot topics converge. Ian Johnston is the founder and creative director of Quinine, a UK-based integrated research, strategy, and design consultancy. And by the way, that's Quinine, Quinine. Ian launched Quinine in 2007 with a mission to help brands create world-class social, cultural, and commercial experiences that enrich customers' everyday lives. With offices in London and Vancouver, Quinine brings together deep research and a top-notch team of designers, architects, and thinkers to translate human insights into meaningful and tangible retail experiences. Quinine has gone on to grow to be one of the top 10% of global design agencies, quite a feat. But Ian is a frequent public speaker within the design industry in retail. He's also a visiting lecturer at the Royal College of Arts. The list of awards, citations, and honors that he and his firm have garnered over the years is really impressive and extensive. But what really grabbed me about Ian, and why I want to share him with you today, isn't just what he does, even though that's certainly spot on in terms of where retail's going next, but the larger principles and the new ways of thinking that he brings to the table. From a retail perspective, you'd have to say it's all about brick and mortar, but it's bigger than that. In fact, I love the term that Ian uses when he talks about the built world, because that's really what we're talking about here. Building the structures that support customer experience, but also how those structures can even drive important causes like diversity and inclusion, sustainability, and community building. So we're going to talk about all of that and have a little bit of fun as we wrap up by doing a lightning round on some of my hottest trajectories that Ian happens to know a lot about. So welcome, Ian. It is so great to have you here today to talk about how design can make a difference in retail.
Carol, thank you so much for having me. What an exciting time.
Yeah, definitely. And particularly in the brick and mortar space. So, and in physical structures, if you will, that built world that you talk about. I'm really excited about continuing to track what's happening there. In particular, I know that you're very passionate about harnessing the power of design in order to make a difference and to think differently about retail. In our offline conversations, you talk specifically about the concept of virtue and being a virtuous brand, not as a sanctimonious empty claim, but really as an aspirational concept that guides all of your work. So tell me more about this idea of what virtuous brands mean to you, and what role do you see stores playing in making that come to life?
Wow, you're just going to drop us right into the deep, darkness of the conversation, Carol. I love it. Don't pause. Let's just dive right in. So,
or
really
the bright light, depending on how you look at it.
Exactly. So, what can I say to that? Everything matters, right? Everything is influencing what we do. The built environment is really important to me. It influences everything I do, and it has an impact, that goes way beyond the essences that we know. It has such a powerful place. Virtue and being good is important to me personally. I kind of live by the mantra of waking up every day and doing something that's kind of, my future self will be proud of. That's a kind of a mantra I think about. And so doing good is important to who I am personally. And it's obviously important to Quinine as a company. It's really important to brands as well, but it's not necessarily a place you can arrive. Like, being virtuous is a very difficult thing. I don't think there are virtuous brands. It's more of a aspiration that we use to drive ourselves. It's kind of like perfection, right? Once you get to perfection, you realize it's not really perfect. And so it's an ever evolving place, but it can guide us. I use it, and we use it inside the teams as a kind of umbrella to capture, all the goodness that brands are doing. We use it to kind of talk about sustainability, to talk about diversity and inclusion, talk a little bit about neurodiversity. There's health and wellness that fits under virtue as well. We're even venturing into the idea of how retailers and their social impact, and the social impact they have in the communities they go into. All of these things matter, and they matter more to us today than ever before. Now, my take on it is that the reason that is because in many ways, the three pillars that we've all been aligning to historically, the government, religion, commerce, they're not working like they used to. Governments are slightly fractioned. There's polarized opinion about which way to go. Religion doesn't necessarily have the same kind of impact or the same kind of engagement. And so I do think that consumers are looking towards commerce for some of those actions, some of that filling in that gap, which is left by these other pillars in society not really being fit for the time we're in.
That's interesting because it sounds like you're saying there just needs to be a bigger umbrella that encapsulates all of those things that have been talked about separately.
Absolutely. So sustainability is a really big one fundamentally, but we see it kind of virtue sitting above that. It brings them all together and gives us sort of a category of virtuous actions or virtuous topics underneath that.
And I love the humble approach too, to where it's intentionally not achievable.
Brands especially, right? Like I look at virtue as being something that it's not driven by a playbook, right? It's something you need to do regardless of the impact or the result afterwards. It's built into your DNA, right? And so understanding that is important, but I think because they're commercial entities, it's very difficult to say that every decision they make is without self-interest. They have shareholders. So I'm not sure really that's obtainable, but it's something we should aspire to do.
Right. Or at least maybe put at the top of the hierarchy and then everything else takes care of itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, that's great. And, one thing I'm super excited to talk to you about under this framing of virtuous branding is the role that solutions and services are starting to play in retail. It's something I've talked about incessantly and how that's going to be such a diversity play for retailers going forward. And that you're just steeped in that world. You work with major telecoms, for example, like Xfinity as part of Comcast here in the US, British Telecom, T-Mobile. But these are companies that aren't steeped in traditional retail, and they may not even think of themselves as being retailers despite their store counts. But at the same time, you've got traditional retailers pushing on the other side where they're trying to get into solutions and services and introduce them into brick and mortar environments. These traditional retailers aren't necessarily very well versed in making solutions and services work in brick and mortar because they tend to be really product focused. So I want to get your thoughts on what all of these newcomers, whatever their origins are, what do they need to know about selling non-tangibles in physical retail? Because I see that it's just only going to accelerate.
It's super interesting, Carol, and just something you just sparked my mind thinking about, why are they looking for these services, right? And generally a lot of these companies who do products, the similarity of products nowadays is pretty stark, right? Is there much difference between a Samsung, whatever it is, S10 versus an iPhone 12, right? Because products are coming together. One way companies can differentiate themselves is through solutions and services. Now, bringing that into store, right, is the complex things. These are intangible products that we're selling. And so it does really take a change of focus. We've been doing, we talk about it as consultative sales or complex services, right? They're getting more and more complex. You talk to the innovators, they want more features. All those features make understanding some of these products and services very, very, very complex. And so we always think of the store as a tool to enable that to happen. And there's a number of elements that can be woven into that. But fundamentally, selling complex services, a key part of that is your staff, right? And if you think about it through your staff, you can tick a lot of boxes. So what do I mean by that? Well, first off, they need to take on a new role, right? They're no longer just sales executives doing transactions. You need to educate them, right? You need to make them experts in what they're talking about. And that's a big shift in the role that they have in the store. And you might want to start thinking about, how the store can enable those staff to perform at their best, right? So a lot of times stores, very transactional store, will have a till at the back of the store, right? That creates a barrier between the staff and the customers. So what we do is we look across that spectrum and we really start to design the whole experience around staff and customers interacting. We're trying to design those moments in. So whether that's at a service desk, right? Like we wouldn't ever build a monolithic barrier at the back. We would look at providing a number of touch points. We might put a cafe table. We might put a bar. We might put a booth, right? All of these different elements come together in your customer journey, right? And what we're doing there is we're looking at the staff and saying, well, the staff want to work in different places, right? Each staff member works in a different way. Each staff should be able to interpret their customer and drive those customers to the part of store that's going to suit that need at the moment, right? So, sitting at a cafe table is a lot more committed kind of experience than if you're standing at a bar, which is perhaps less committed than if you're in a booth. All of these things matter. Is your staff, and are you facing, as a staff member, are you facing your customer or are you side by side, right? Now, there is no right answer. It's just that every customer has different needs and wants different things from that experience. You can still take that same thinking in the way that you display your products, right? You need to think of how your staff and your customer can go on that journey together. Think about an assisted sale, right? And so one of the things that we did, which was quite fundamental, most modules of a store are 600 mil or 1200 mil, 24 inch or 48 inch, right? But if you really look at that and dissect it, 24 inches is too small for a staff member and a customer to come together and interact. 48 inches is too big, right? You can't have the right density of product in that space. You lose merchandising space. So we did with one of our clients, we convinced them to go to 900, right? It's the perfect kind of product density, but it also allows staff and customers to stand there together, interacting together. And so we try to weave those moments throughout the whole experience, whether it's product display, service interactions, is how they could actually go together.
That's so interesting because now, traditional retail environments are calibrated to maximize selling space. It's fascinating to think about how those calibrations that you do on behalf of your clients, because I'm sure most of them are not thinking down to that level, are all about engagement and that intangible experience, not only just for the customer, but also for the store associates. This idea of options to where everybody has, or a micro environment that's comfortable for them.
Well, and customizable, right? I mean, that's the whole point, is no one customer journey is the same. When you take a staff interaction point and you spread that across 5 different points, right? You're now able as a staff member to customize that experience for that customer. And so every customer who comes in a store can almost have a unique customer experience, unique to them, that fits their needs at that moment.
That in some ways might do away with the need for additional formats. I mean, if you have one format that is flexible like that, then you can get a lot more done with it, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I know agile formats and multi-formats is that's almost addressing a different problem, Carol. That's just, that the movement towards that direction, I think, addresses something else. What we're talking about here is taking that agility and mobility within the experience, the singular store experience, and absolutely, you get more out of it, right? Not only that, when you change sizes, you can flex that format a lot easier because you have more pieces,
more variables to move.
Yeah, more variables to move, and you can build a hierarchy of fixtures and say, well, in this size, this matters, right? In this store, because it's actually a community high street as opposed to, a flagship or a kind of a more shopping destination high street, you might choose certain fixtures that are going to fit to that context better.
You touched on something else that I think is really not something you hear a lot about, creating environments that are friendly to your workers, that inspire your workers, that make them work better. What kind of difference can that make? I mean, is that something that should be at the top of the hierarchy or parentheses somewhere? And what does it look like to design for your workers and not just for customers?
Yeah, I mean, Carol, it's always a delicate subject because, of course, the customer matters, right? We talk about how, great staff experiences can amplify the customer experience, right? And so, paying attention to your staff, they're the other user. I mean, there's a whole number. We talk about customer experience and user experience. There's a number of different users that a physical store has. The customer is one of them. The staff member is one of them. There's lots of other ones, right? Suppliers, headquarters, all of those things, all those groups of people. We need to design all of those experiences in many ways. We have a tendency to focus on staff because they're so powerful, right? They can really make or break an experience. I mean, I have been designing stores for nearly 20 years now, and I love what I do. I'm very grateful for what I do. But if you were asked me to what was going to have more impact, a brand new fancy store or a great store manager, I'm going to take the store manager every time. But you put those two things together, Carol, and magic can happen. True magic can happen. And so one way, and we're always doing this, we're always flipping things, right? And so that's the important thing. In order to look at things differently, even if it's for a moment, when you do that, it just shows you different opportunities. And that's really what we try to do, right? Show the opportunities where we can bring them to light and have conversations with people. So when you think about staff, you go, wait a minute, the store is a place they work. That's their office. Maybe I should design it with that in mind, right? And that brings up different kinds of opportunities, right? That information and that data is already out there. There's tons of studies done on workplaces and how impactful they are, right? They talk about studies that, reduce, a great inspiring space reduces, absenteeism. It makes them perform, and their actual productivity is 20% higher. Depends on which, metric you look at. But there's a number of things that we think about. So store and an inspiring spaces can inspire people, right? And that's really powerful. Fundamentally, at the bottom of this, though, underpinning all of this is if as a business you demonstrate, talk about, show your staff that you care, right? They're going to care right back with you, right? And that's really what we're talking about. And so whether it's creating inspiring spaces, and you can use all the design methods that we talk about, and many of those are the same that we use for customers to make inspiring spaces, right? We're just flipping the conversation and thinking that through the lens of the staff. You need to offer your staff choice. You need to make them feel comfortable and safe, right? There's a lot of little aspects that you can really start to, dive into and just look at it through a different lens. And that's what we do with the staff.
What's great about that is it sounds like you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that creating worker-friendly environments isn't at odds with creating customer-friendly environments. It's just another consideration that maybe might even add improvements for customer experience.
100%. Carol, it's not actually in contrast at all. They're absolutely working together. I mean, my insight was this, right? When I go into store and that staff member is engaged and motivated and inspired, everything in that store is amplified. And so why wouldn't we inspire and try to inspire our staff through the place they work?
I like that. I'm going to borrow that. Store associate as amplifier.
It does it from my experience when I go in the store, and I think we can design that in, right? Like this is the thing. I think if you actually think about it and you go through your journey, not as a customer, but as a staff, your store journey as a staff member, what are the things that matter, right? How do I show my staff that I care? One of the things that we're always confronted with is budgets are getting tight. We need to start cutting and reducing some costs for a new store format we've just designed. Oh, I know. Let's cut the staff room, guys. Let's pull that all back. That's a classic cost-cutting exercise, and it's got some merit. But I always try to, suggest don't do that, guys. Your back of house should be as nice as your front of house, right? Because what you're doing is when you downsize the back of house, you're telling the staff They don't care. They don't care as much as my customers do, right? I think staff matter more than customers.
Wow. Just not a consideration that you hear a lot about, and doesn't sound like it's just impossible to achieve or necessarily adds cost. And when you talk about sensitivity around budgets and things like that, especially when you're talking about these solution and service providers, I have to believe that sometimes it's a struggle to get them to even think like retailers or to own the fact that they are a retailer. How do you get them to invest in these spaces and really appreciate the value that physical retail can bring to customer experience and, of course, to driving the bottom line?
Mm. I mean, and especially our client, I mean, it's so true, Carol. Like our clients generally don't consider themselves as retailers, right? They're a network or a media company. But you have 1,000 stores. Oh, well, maybe I am a retailer. And so, in their cycle and the sort of maturity that they go through, there's a tipping point when they actually realize, and I've seen it 3 or 4 times now, easily, where they actually start to take note and realize that retail is a really valuable channel, right? And so what we have a tendency to do is we look at incremental change, especially with these big businesses, right? They're not even looking at retail as a viable channel. It's almost a legacy thing that they've got to do. And so, you know, it only needs one little project to start tipping the balance, to show these big companies, the impact that good design can actually have. And so through a kind of process like that, now really at the top, you need a great leader. Ultimately, great leaders enact change and can make things happen. What we try to do is give them the information at the right time so they can make better decisions faster, right? And so it's through small projects that we've built up credibility. That credibility has had an impact. It's got results. Great leaders take that and build business cases around that to present back to the business, to remind them, hey guys, here is an untapped channel we haven't actually been selling to. I've got 6,000 people coming through my store. I'm not selling them anything. Look at what we can do here.
Yeah. Well, and so it sounds like you take the long view and in some cases sort of a walk before you run proposition.
Absolutely. My background is in product design, so I'm very keen on this iterative process, right? It doesn't have to be the big change all at once. Sometimes that's never going to get everyone aligned behind you. Small little incremental change that have impact can demonstrate the power of design.
Well, and I'm sure they appreciate that you have an actual product design background because you understand product and you understand the importance of product and merchandising product and all that goes into it. So I'm sure that helps build bridges to those conversations.
I hope so. I mean, we're always kind of weaving, the brand, the user, and fundamentally the space that you use to sell that product, right, or service. It's usually part of the equation that's left to the end. We try to persuade people to talk about that from the beginning.
Ah, I see. Going back to those hierarchies and priorities again.
Absolutely.
One inescapable fact when you're talking about all of this and balancing all of these different priorities is how e-commerce has just completely taken off during the pandemic. But I think the level that it hit surprised a lot of folks in good ways because a lot of retailers have built these online platforms and they're really happy to see them getting monetized. I've been predicting or forecasting that there is going to be pent-up demand for brick and mortar once the pandemic winds down. But this shift to digital isn't going away, and it's just, I think, going to continue to accelerate. So how does that reality shift the way that retailers should think about brick and mortar? And beyond what we're hearing a lot about, which are these tactical, literal reactions like using stores as fulfillment centers, what are the other aspects that tie into this increase in online shopping?
I mean, it's so interesting, Carol. We talk about this a lot, right? There's a lot of anxiety, certainly with our clients and people within the industry. Online sales is up to 25%. It's up to 30%. What we always talk about is, you know what, guys, I don't think the customer cares. right? I don't think the customer actually delineates where they bought it. They don't talk about in-store or online. They just talk about I've purchased it. And so we always say, does it really matter where they buy it? Just as long as they buy it, right? And I think that sort of idea, coupled with the fact that, as you said, this is happening. There is no doubt in my mind that online sales will outdo in-store sales sometime in the near future, right? And I think we should stop worrying about that fact and start understanding what it means, right? Because fundamentally, it's shifting the structure and the strategies that all businesses use. Yesterday the store was at the center, the epicenter of this business strategy, right? It was the cornerstone of your distribution strategy. I don't know if that's the case anymore. I put a digital platform at that center. And if a digital platform is at the center of a business strategy, maybe we should rethink the purpose of the store or redefine the purpose of the store so that it can help grow the digital platform, right? And so it's just about shifting the mindset. The store is no longer the epicenter. A digital platform is, or online channel is at the center. How can my store be used to help that channel grow and support that channel? So when I think about that, I think about, okay, well, what are all the gaps in the online channel, right? Well, we know it's great for transactions, right? It's perfect. I can browse, I can do, there's a lot of great things out of it. But one of the things it doesn't do is it's not very human, right? So if I think about my store, how can my store fill that gap? How can my store help grow my online digital platform? Well, I can use my store staff. I can optimize my labor for my store staff and still bring a human touch to my online platform when I start to use tools like live streaming, holding events in stores. So there's a number of different aspects that if pivoting the store, aligning it to a business strategy that has digital at the center, I start to rethink everything. A whole bunch of new opportunities emerge, right? So the store itself doesn't have to be focused on transactions, right? You can focus the store on retention and acquisition, something we've been talking about for forever, but it's happening now, right? A recent study by Bain talked about, an increase in 5% of retention can offer you anywhere between 25% and 95% increased profits. So retention is a really, really powerful thing. Why are you not using your store for that rather than transactions and product distribution? Because the online channel does that so much better, so much more efficient, right? Especially with next day delivery. And so when I start to think and I realign the purpose of my store to focus on helping my digital platform grow, a whole bunch of new opportunities emerge.
And that's such a great point because even though retailers don't necessarily own it, I still think there's a mindset out there that stores are in competition with online. Brick and mortar retailers are always thinking about how can we wrestle back this brick and mortar opportunity and change those numbers. What you're saying is just own that reality. Think about the ways that the stores can do what stores uniquely do best and store associates. And I love your point about humanizing the online experience because the goal of a lot of these brick and mortar stores, especially these digitally native brands, is to create a relationship with the brand that will then continue in the digital space. That really is a powerful shift in thinking that I hope more retailers are going to adopt.
Me too. And I think, we talked earlier about the product density, right? Well, product density doesn't matter anymore then, right? You're not having those internal fights about SKU numbers because the store is doing something different than what online does.
Absolutely. I can see that. I'd like to get your thoughts on what you see internationally, sort of that pulling that camera back. Which markets you see as being directional, in particular for retail design, what's inspiring you? I'd love to get your global perspective on that.
I mean, such a great question, Carol. I mean, difficult, I guess, at this moment, because once I had one difficulty is I haven't traveled, and so seeing other markets and experiencing them right now is difficult. because we haven't had that ability to travel and see them. I always think there's a difference between seeing something and experiencing it versus reading about it. That said, the interesting thing what we're seeing right now is, everyone is at kind of different stages. And so different things are happening at different parts of the world at different times. Now, I don't know if that's just the current conditions we have and it's polarized that, but that's interesting in what's happening where now. So it's difficult to understand if they're happening there because they're open or because the culture and the social interaction is driving those innovations. But if I just reflect kind of the things that I've seen and experienced, in the East and in China and Japan, and the way that they've integrated digital into their store experiences, whether that's a device in hand or, I read this morning that Burberry has just launched an online virtual store, right? So their use of technology is really aspiring. And I think that is just coming this way. They use it much more in store out east than we do here in the UK and in America as well. And that lends itself to the live streaming and all of those aspects of device in hand. Bring your own device to store is something they do a lot of. I think that's going to really take flight in the next 6 to 12 months everywhere. And if I look at the other way, what's perhaps being developed here in the UK and America and the States and in Canada is a kind of, this, and it's difficult to say because I haven't been yet to Asia or other parts of the world because of the travel, but I generally feel that the virtue agenda is really being leveraged a bit more with brands from the UK. And so I can see that kind of, coming out, and America. We see a lot of projects coming up where we're talking about social responsibility and how those appear in store. So I think that's going to, hit the world going right to left, and then sort of technology and the use of technology I'm integrating it is going to come up the other way.
Interesting. That's an interesting way of putting it, and it goes back to that digital first mindset.
Yeah, I totally, and it's hard to say, but I think that might be an infrastructure issue in terms of the retailing here is quite it's got a long history, and so the systems they have in are much more difficult to integrate. Whereas, it's the direct to consumer selling point. They don't have a legacy of systems they've got to integrate. They can just dive into that digital space and integrate digital from the start, which is such an advantage if you don't have to play with legacy systems.
Yeah, absolutely. True. And it's going to be interesting to see when more of those digitally native brands hang a shingle, the way that that's going to accelerate all kinds of disruption and innovation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I do think they have just a different mindset, right? They don't see the two channels. They just see, an integrated channel.
I would like to blast through just sort of a lightning round of a few trajectories. I talk about my retail trajectories in most of the episodes, but I love to get experts like you weighing in on them. So if you're game...
I'll try, Carol. I'll try, Carol.
I think they're up your alley.
I'll give it a go.
So let's see. But if you can just give me your quick takes on a few of these trajectories just as we wrap up.
Perfect.
Particularly, we alluded to it earlier, something I call multi-format mojo, which is just the fact that the most successful retailers these days are already multi-format retailers. It's going to be the rule rather than the exception. So what do you think are the benefits or maybe the downsides or the best practices for executing multi-format strategies?
Okay, well, multi-format strategy is definitely, of the moment. This one-size-fits-all structure or strategy we've been using for the last 20 years is no longer fit for purpose, right? And so, when you design an experience so broad, especially a store experience, so broadly to target everyone, it actually doesn't target anyone. And so multi-formats allow us to go into an environment or a community with the right offer, right? And so we talk about agility and flexibility, but for me, multi-formats is definitely on the rise. I think it will be here to stay. It's no longer one size fits all. I'm not even sure it's hub and spoke anymore. I think it's beyond that. Specific environments for specific reasons.
Okay, yep, you get a big here from me.
So some of the downsides obviously is scale, right, Carol? And so that's going to provide budgetary concerns, right? Because the way people achieve expansion and large scale distribution strategies is through scale. When you're designing a one-off store format for every store, that's complicated, right? That's not going to happen. So that we're going to need to figure out a balance where we can get scale in a multi-format scenario.
Well, that makes me want to jump to something that ties into that, which is the conversation around localization. Localization pops up, it kind of goes in cycles in retail, and it becomes more sophisticated, of course, with all the data that's available. But the question always seems to be, how much is too much? Going back to what you just said, because if everything is special, it compromises scale and arguably even profitability if you don't do it right. But if nothing is special, then you just end up with a cookie cutter chain and you don't have a point of view. We've talked about multiple formats. What about the localization aspect of that?
So for me, I see it in kind of a spectrum, Carol, where you have kind of localization at maybe the starting point. It might not be a spectrum, but it's a pathway. Localization is a starting point. It talks about putting a name of your store on your facade, or tweaking some messaging in store to make it resonate with the local community. That has some impact, but that's been going on for 20 years, that kind of localization. And so I think that's just the baseline now. I think we need to start thinking about not just localization, but how brands can involve their community, how they can become part of the community, right? Now, when I start to take that pathway or start thinking in that way, of course, you might build your store out of local materials, right? But you can't do that at every store, talking about scale. So what are the things you can do at scale to make it local? It doesn't always come down to redesigning your format. There's lots of things you can think about and do to create that local feel or embed yourself in the community without changing your store design at all. So why don't you hire locally, right? Right off the bat, you're going to bring a whole wealth of knowledge just into the store. Why don't you get your cleaners to be from the community, or the builders who built the store, right? All of those things start to build in an integrated community effort, right? Why don't you sponsor a sports team, right? Why don't you celebrate local makers? Why don't you bring the community into your environment, right? So there's lots of things I think you can do without the complexities of scale.
Interesting, and it sounds like a lot of those are that human factor that we keep talking about.
Everything matters, Carol, and I think it doesn't have to be a huge cost thing. We can actually build in and design services in store.
When we talk about multi-format and kind of blowing out one of those formats, I talk a lot about letting your flagship fly, which is sort of the contrarian side of what you hear so much about, all these small formats and everything getting smaller and more efficient and more productive. But then you've got these flagships that I've been saying are going to continue to pop up. What do you think about these flagship stores and the opportunities for that particular format?
Well, we could do a whole podcast, I think, on that topic alone, but I'll try to keep it concise. So I'm a big believer in the flagships. And as you said, I think we need, I'm not even sure people know what that means anymore, right? Is it the best? Is it tied to a location? Is it the best experience? What is it? And so I think there's a number of ways to look at it. When I look at it for what it is today, key store within the estate, I think it has much more room to grow. Right now, it's actually tied to a location, and I don't think it should be. Right, I think it should be defined by the location it's in, but not tied to it. And what I mean by that is just think about how a local flagship store could have a global appeal, right? And those are things through. We can use the flagship to start to broadcast from it. We can do live streaming from the stores, all of these aspects start to extend out the reach of that flagship store, which just make it more valuable, right?
Well, and it obviously doesn't sound like it's limited to size. It's not about size, it's about function.
I think it's about, we were trying to understand here about what actually defines a flagship. Is it commitment by the company, by the brand? Is it size? Is it location? Traditionally, it has been about all those things. I think it's much more open now. We would really like to start to encourage people to use the flagship. Imagine if one of these big global brands, like someone like Samsung, took a flagship and put it in a deprived area, right? Think about the impact, the social impact that could have, right? That community would start to feel a greater sense of worth, right? Individuals would start to feel a greater sense of worth, self-actualization. These people care about me, right? So a flagship can have a huge amount of impact just by putting it into a certain area and location. So I think we really need to define and go away and explore, like you said, what does this thing do, right? I think there's a lot of possibilities with that notion of a flagship.
The point about not limiting them to these major urban centers when these stores can have such a power to change communities. That's a really great point that I hope that more retailers are going to explore. Well, when we talk about these flagships too, one of the purposes that they serve often or have, that's where retailers run lots of experiments. My trajectory for that is mad for multi-testing.
Yep,
They're getting really comfortable testing and learning and even failing fast.
Accepting
and not making
failure.
Not making it so painful, thinking that everything has to continue just because they've invested in it. What do you think about a store as a lab? What are the best practices, or what are you seeing, or what do you espouse in terms of running experiments in brick and mortar?
It's very powerful, Carol. I think in the past we've done a number of iterations of that. We've created testing sites, in a warehouse, right? And they bring a certain level of realness to it. But I'm a big fan for really testing out in the public, right? And the feedback you get by building real experiences. We call them learning stores, right? Where you go and you learn what works, what doesn't work, right? And having real customers and real staff, experience that in a really functioning store, you learn so much so quick. But for me, the key is, as I said before, you can't be afraid to fail. Like, you learn so much more from failing than success. And so being a product designer, iteration is part of our process. We try to do things quickly, right? And so we'll even design, research tools to go into that learning store to glean and extract the insights that we need. Now, if we do that, we can do it very quickly, right? Like, these things should happen quite quickly. You can change something in a store, make a prototype, 3D print it, put it in store the next day, and see, firsthand, has it had an impact? And so for me, they're really, really valuable. And I'm really glad more and more retailers are taking that pathway. Test in the real. It's powerful.
And testing in physical spaces and not just thinking of the digital playground in that regard.
100%. I mean, my focus is around the physical world, and I just think, I know it's a little bit more expensive and a little bit more scary than maybe testing and iterating and learning through online and digital, but the impact can be huge.
Well, and especially when folks have partners like you that just take the ball and run with it, and they don't necessarily have to think about it because you're doing the research for them.
Absolutely.
One thing that I know that you're really passionate about, and I didn't want to leave out, is what I call sustainability's second act. To me, that means that retailers, they can't just phone it in anymore, that sustainability can't be a PR play. They'll get busted, if nothing else, because there's so much transparency these days in their practices. But what do you think?
Authenticity is key. Yeah,
right. And you have to accept that that's a reality. You can run, but you can't hide.
Absolutely.
But, and tying back into your virtuous brand proposition, though, too, it's just the right thing to do. So where do you see sustainability going next, and where do you see the opportunities?
I'm super happy and glad that sustainability is firmly back on the agenda. But I don't see sustainability as an endpoint. It's a pathway, right? It's a journey we all go on. And so it's important to communicate that you're on that journey, right? It's a number of steps. I don't know if you ever arrive there. It's a number of places along the way. The key, I think, is especially for brands that are not built on environmental, strategy, or sustainability is not part of their DNA, it's something they aspire and want to do, is you kind of, to avoid the greenwashing aspect, you got to take your customers with you on that journey, right? You got to help them understand why you're doing this, why it makes sense, and the impact it's having to you and your business. And so how we talk about that in store, for me, is really a missed opportunity. So right now, a lot of these virtuous actions that we talk about are usually delivered with, marketing messages, maybe even online, and don't even ever appear in store. I believe that's a huge missed opportunity, and we should, retailers should be using their stores to tell stories, right? About social causes, the impact that they can have. Now, the reason the store is so powerful is because it's physical storytelling. I'm going to resort back to my favorite, Chinese proverb, which says, tell me and I forget, show me and I'll remember, involve me and I'll understand, right? And so if we can start to persuade brands to use the store to highlight some of their sustainable stories and involve the consumer or the community in that story, well, they're going to learn about taking action. They're going to learn about changing behavior. And really, that's where the real power is, right? That's what we want people to do. We don't want people just to become aware of these social issues and aware of sustainability. We want them to change their behavior towards that. And I think when brands start to involve customers in their story and the benefits and the positivity that a sustainable pathway can bring, we're going to have some real impact in a wider context. And for me, that's really, really exciting.
And well, what I hear you saying there is, though, instead of thinking of sustainability as something you're reacting to, you're saying that I believe that retailers can be in a leadership role and an education role, and they can drive sustainability forward rather than just thinking of it as a reaction.
100%. And it goes back to one of the things we spoke about right at the beginning, Carol, where brands themselves can create change. People in society no longer rely or trust the government. I'm very generalizing here, so excuse me. Religion doesn't have the same resonance in today's world. And so they're looking for someone to fill that gap. Brands and the commercial pillar is definitely able to fill that gap, right? People are looking to brands to fill that gap. So yeah, I think there's a huge amount of power in that in itself, because as soon as people start seeing themselves in brands and aligning their own values to the values of brands, that's where you get, longevity and loyalty. And that's, for me, really what we're trying to build here. We're trying to get longevity and build loyalty with our customers.
That's a whole new perspective on it. I think it's going to require a lot of confidence on the part of retailers to even think they have those kinds of superpowers, rather than just thinking in that old traditional mindset.
Totally, Carol. But I think we've arrived at a moment in society, whether that's the acceleration that COVID's produced, where we're almost open to these new worlds, right? Like, we should be able to take risk. Not doing something is a problem, but taking a risk and acting, I think we're much more open to that now than we were a year ago, especially within retail, because retail's fundamentally changing.
Yeah. Well, as I've been saying, disruptive times give you permission to do more disruptive things.
I love that.
And in that vein, I close every one of these interviews with one question, and you can answer it any way that you see fit now that we're in this visionary mindset. So it's well placed here.
Okay.
And that's just simply to ask you what's next.
For me or for the world or for retail? Well, why don't we focus on retail? What's next for retail for me is that they need to realign the purpose of the store towards their new business strategies, right? This accelerated COVID experience that we've just happened, is changing things. And so I think that's really going to happen over the next, 6 to 12 months. If you ask me what's next for Quinine, we're still kind of pushing on with our virtuous outlook. I think we broadcast an article this week about neurodiversity, and we're really pushing that on and really going to dive in to talk about the social impact that brands can have, beyond their store. And so those are things that are kind of driving us, and hopefully they'll help brands see the impact that they have, on the wider society.
And speaking of that article, which I think is going to be really groundbreaking and going to be such a big topic in retail going forward, do I have it right that is that breaking out tomorrow, or is that when you're publishing it, or?
I think that happens on the Tuesday. It's in the next week, Carol.
Oh, okay. Well, this episode is going to publish on Thursday, so that article should be out by the time everyone's listening. So check that out, everyone. I think that's going to be a groundbreaking article, and really appreciate how you guys provide that kind of thought leadership, to the industry that certainly ties into design, but isn't exclusive to it.
We'll keep pushing, Carol. We'll keep pushing.
Well, I appreciate you pushing through this interview today and covering so many topics with me. I could just talk to you all day, and we could just do deep dives into any one of the topics that we've addressed. And I so appreciate your time today and your insights that are so, I think, uncommon, and yet a lot of things that we need to start thinking about in terms of where things are going next.
Well, Carol, I just appreciate you reached out, and we had this opportunity to meet and have this conversation. As you said, the key is to get people thinking about these topics, because these things really matter.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Ian. I look forward to following your progress and your thought leadership. If you want to contact Ian, you can reach him via email at ian@quinine.com. And again, that's QUININE.com. You can learn more about Quinine at quinindesign.com. And Ian is also on LinkedIn, Ian Johnston. And I do think this is great timing because of the release of the article. You also have, I think, some other articles that touch on things that we've talked about, like associate engagement. So definitely visit the quinindesign.com website to check all of that out. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this episode of Speakerman Speaks Retail. And in future episodes, I'm going to be talking to more smart folks like Ian, who are going to help us understand what really is happening in retail and where things are going next and what we can do about it. And we're going to keep tracking those retail trajectories. So I hope you'll continue to listen in every other Thursday. Our next episode is going to break on April 8th. And you can follow me on Twitter at RetailExpert, XPERT. You can visit my site at speakermanretail.com or contact me directly at carol@speakermanretail.com. Thank you so much for listening in, and I'll see you next time.